Welcome to the Delighted Customers Podcast, now part of the Agile Brand Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mark Slayton, and I'm thrilled to have you join us. My mission is to empower leaders to delight their customers. Each episode, I bring on guests from diverse backgrounds who share valuable insights, wisdom, and practical tips that you can apply right away. Well, I have a special treat on today's Delighted Customers podcast. I always love to interview people from other countries, but I love to hear people talk who are from England. Just that British accent is so special, and we're going to get treated to that today with my guest, who is Stuart Gilchriest. Stuart is a certified customer experience professional. He's worked in CX for 10 years, more than 10 years, across multiple industries, including hospitality, education, travel, vehicle rental for Hertz, and HR technology for UKG. And he is currently the Director of Sales Experience at Mercury Insurance, a mid-sized P&C insurance carrier based in Los Angeles. And he's passionate about the CX discipline. And we're going to talk today about how to build relationships with people in your organization, particularly key stakeholders. And he's in a unique situation that he is at the beginning stages, the early stages of his work at Mercury. Stuart, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
And a pleasure to have you on the show. Before we get started, let's have a little bit of fun. If somebody was going to the UK, what would you say is one thing that they would not want to miss out on?
Oh, that is it. God, you throw me a curveball straight out the gate. I would say getting outside of London, because the one mistake that most people make is going to London and calling that the UK done. There's so much more. When you get into the countryside and the different countries, right? Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, if you've been to the UK and you've been to London and you think you've done it, then go back and go see the rest of it, because there's so much more out there.
That's a great tip. And you're in the US, right? You're in Florida, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And so what do you, this is an odd way to start a podcast, but I'm fascinated with, I've had probably 5 or 6 guests from the UK. It's just the way it worked out. What would you say, you've been here a while, what do you miss the most about the UK?
Well, I think my friends and family would say, you miss the people. And if I don't say that, I'll probably get in trouble. But the real answer to what you're saying, what you're asking me is the food, right? I think it's, those food has such an emotive, memory, brings back so many great memories of when you were there. So little things. I managed to import quite a lot of it. I have a healthy supply of tea. In particular, that I'm able to get through here, which kind of keeps me connected. But yeah, especially that, the food, those comfort food dishes that you had when you were a kid, I think those are the things that you end up missing the most, beyond obviously friends and family.
It's interesting you mentioned tea. As we continued to, we can't even say digress, because we didn't even get into the meat of our topic yet. But in a previous life, I worked in Washington, D.C., and one of our clients was the British Embassy. And it was interesting, you mentioned tea. At about 2:30 or 3 o'clock every day, people just kind of stopped what they were doing. They went to the cafeteria and they had tea and this assorted like scones and crumpets and all these things that were amazing.
Yeah. Some stereotypes are there for a reason. And we do love our tea in England.
Well, speaking of ways to connect with people, tell us about what you're doing. I mentioned you're at the early stages of your journey. Tell us a little bit about what you've got in front of you, what you're doing now.
Yeah, so I joined Mercury Insurance a couple of months ago. Really fantastic company, really fantastic leadership who really see the opportunity for a mid-sized carrier such as Mercury. So probably less brand recognition than some of our competitors, to lead through experience and to stand out through experience, and for that to be our competitive differentiation within a pretty competitive market, let's be honest. So we're really on this transformation as a team of really experienced CX professionals to help to take Mercury to that next level. And the way that the leadership have identified to do that is really through the experience, which, I'm sure everyone listening to the podcast will agree. It's just a great environment to be in where, people understand that this thing has value and that your expertise is really valued within the organization because you're going to help them get there. So it's been a really good couple of months so far. We've got a lot of hard work ahead of us, but a lot of opportunities to really make some step changes in the experience for our customers and for our independent agents who actually sell a lot of our policies on our behalf. So it's a really exciting company, and it's a really exciting time to be in the industry.
So yeah, 100% agree with you about the commoditization of insurance. I worked in financial services. I worked for a bank, so clearly there's a need for differentiation in banking as well. And we had an insurance division at the time. And so when I ask you to compare and contrast, you came from a very large human resources payroll. They were the payroll my bank used, UKG. I think Phil Mickelson, the golfer, was a spot, or you advertised, sponsored him on the tour, big name. And now you're at Mercury. Can you kind of give us a sense of the the compare and contrast, kind of the difference of what you're up against there?
Yeah, I think it's the most obvious difference is it's B2B versus B2C. And I think in CX and having done B2C prior to moving to UKG in that B2B world, that was a transition for me to get my head around that for sure.
Hmm.
I think we've all, or most of us, have rented cars or bought insurance in the B2C businesses that I've worked in, for example. But I personally have never bought HR software. And so transplanting yourself into the mind of a buyer and a user of a B2B company's product is often much more difficult and takes a lot more work to really understand that before you start working internally with stakeholders to help them improve the experience. It takes a little bit longer to really get into the nuts and bolts of the product, the service, the experience in a B2B company. But I think in insurance, our biggest challenge is often it's the thing that you don't want to think about as a consumer, right? It's not a decision that you want to spend a lot of time thinking about. You want you want that peace of mind and that security to know that it's there, but you hope you never have to interact with your insurance company to make a claim, for example. Um, so it can be an interesting experience challenge to think through, well, how do we make that memorable and exceptional? How do we make that an experience that drives loyalty for our customer base when often it's not front and center of people's minds, and the strategy shouldn't be to make it front and center of people's minds because it's not something that gets people excited, and that's okay. It's still a very valuable service to have. A lot of people need it for various reasons, and we have to make that buying and that servicing experience as good as it can possibly be so that we retain our revenue and grow as much as we possibly can in the future.
Excellent. All right. Thank you for giving us some of that background. And today, I think we talked about focusing on the job in front of you, which is like we shared. You're at the early stages of this approach that you're going to have, which is trying to do exactly what you said: differentiate based on the experience to many of the independent dealers and folks that you work with in a market that's mature. It's highly commoditized. So you've got to stand out somehow. But first, you've got to build relationships inside the organization. That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about 3 steps to building great relationships with key stakeholders in an organization. And so before we get into like the how to do that, let's lay some groundwork of why, first of all, why is this such a big deal?
Well, I think for me, we talk a lot in CX about the what of CX, right? Voice of customer programs, journey mapping, metrics, and all of that is so, so important. I don't want to diminish the importance of that. But we often neglect, in my opinion, the how. How do you get it done? How can you be effective in your organization And we all know that the CX program that you run is only as good as the change and the impact that it drives through your organization. So I think it's an underserved topic, frankly, to think about the how of CX and how we can do that well. I've learned some lessons along the way, made a lot of mistakes. I've learned from some really great CX leaders in the past. So hopefully over the next 20 minutes, half an hour or so, we can dive into some of those examples and share it for your audience.
Love to do that. But would you mind sharing with us as people think about this? What are some of the misconceptions that people have about building relationships inside the organization?
I think the biggest misconceptions, or yeah, the biggest challenge that people have is that they think that relationship building is easy. And I would
Mm,
say it's easy to do okay. It's
mm,
very difficult to do really well. Um, and I think the other thing that people often talk about when they think about building relationships is, that isn't going to lead to like real measurable business value because the best ideas are going to win the day. If I have great ideas or great insights from my data or whatever that is, then that will carry me through and make me successful. And I think in my experience, it's the exact opposite. Sometimes, learning how to navigate the organization, navigate how to work with different styles of leaders and stakeholders and help them be successful is often more important than the actual content of your ideas and how good they are. Clearly, you need to have good ideas, but if they don't go anywhere, they're not worth the paper they're written on. So I think some of the misconceptions is that it's like soft and fluffy and it doesn't drive real business value. But it's the means to an end for all the hard work that you and your teams put in when it comes to understanding what customers need. If you can't translate that in a way that drives impact and drives value, then you're going to have some real challenges. And I think there's a lot of people out in the CX space who've experienced those challenges in the past and probably are currently for exactly that reason.
What do you think then are some of the key mistakes? You mentioned maybe you made some mistakes, but what do you think are some common mistakes leaders make in this regard?
Yeah, I think for CX in particular, it's very tempting to think short term and transactional. And what I mean by that is you come into a role or you get promoted into a role internally and you think, okay, CX, not sure how people view this thing. It doesn't have the same reputation as some of the bigger departments. We need to prove value from day one. And it's a yes and, in my opinion. Of course, you need to be proving value. Of course, you need to be working on those quick wins, that low hanging fruit to really make sure that people get it. They get why you're around. But if you're really short sighted and narrow focused on the here and now, and I would say anything in the next 12 months is kind of the here and now. And if you're not thinking about where you and your program want to be 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, then you may end up burning out, right? You'll get some good momentum. And then when the really difficult conversations come around changing some established business practices or making some trade offs that will be potentially financially challenging in the short term, but will lead to long term success, if you haven't laid that groundwork, then that can ultimately it can cap your ability to drive success over the long term. And I think that's sometimes the mistake that we think about the here and now. What are we doing right now? But you have to balance that tension between the short term and the long term. When you're thinking about your CX roadmap, if you just think about, well, what does it look like for the next 12 months? Because that's all my boss is asking me for, then I think we're missing a trick, right? I think you've got to be thinking about what are the problems that I want to solve in 2 or 3 years' time, and then think about, well, what skills and knowledge do I need in my team now in order to do that? And then what data should we start collecting? What should we start doing? What should we start learning in order to be in a good position in 2 to 3 years' time? You've got to find that balance between talking to people and helping them here and now, but also setting up your program for future success.
Yeah, so I want to pull out a gem there that you maybe two that you just shared. One you said explicitly, one you said implicitly that I want to double click on. The one that you said explicitly was think short term and long term. It's not either or, but if you miss the long term, then you're going to end up down the road, you're going to end up in trouble for some reason. You're going to end up, when the challenge comes, you're not going to be ready. And then kind of connected to that, what you said implicitly was, if your CX roadmap is only 1 year long. So the idea of having a CX roadmap is critical. And to your point, it needs to be more than 1 year. And probably, as we get into the topic of key stakeholder relationship building, you don't do it in a vacuum with just the CX department, right?
Absolutely. It needs to be plugged into who are you supporting within the business? What are their leaders' goals? How are you going to help them be successful? What are the metrics they care about? What are the things that are going to make you and your team valuable to them? And again, that's short term and long term, right? And that will change. That's the other thing. It's very easy to come into a company or come into a role and get a static snapshot of what's important to those leaders in that moment. But I believe you've got to keep revisiting that, and you've got to keep rewriting those pages and pages of notes that you take, because winds change, external factors change, internal factors change, and you've got to keep in touch and go deeper than just those kind of check-ins that we've all had of how are things going at the moment, anything I can help with. You've got to get into what's keeping them up at night. What are their biggest challenges? Where do they want to take their team in the next 3 years, and how can you help them to be successful? So they're often thinking long term. You've got to be plugged into their long term thinking as well as their short term.
I'm so glad you said that. And what, again, another gem there is, so those of you listening probably are aware that I offer a masterclass for CX leaders, and it's called the Trusted Guide Roadmap. And the guide piece of it is connected to what Stuart just shared, which is the idea of not falling into what I call the hero trap, which is trying to do it all on your own, trying to get it done. And this would be a good example, would be building a CX roadmap in a vacuum, doing it yourself, trying to guess at what the data you need to collect is, and not, to what you just said, Stuart, not thinking about what their goals are, these key stakeholders, which could create an adversarial relationship. Maybe I can use a simple story of a mistake that I made, a big mistake, when it comes to this particular area, as a segue to get into some recommendations that you may have about maybe how we can go about this effectively, and what you're kind of in the midst of going through now. And that is about 3 or 4 years into my journey at a bank, one of the goals we had was to try and establish a lagging indicator for CX and the health of our customer base. And we decided with a group of people, cross-functional group, maybe 3 or 4 people and one of the executives, to come up with a metric. And the metric was going to be we called it a client engagement index. And it was a share of wallet, really ultimately a share of wallet. The idea is that the executives want us to fire on all pistons. Why have a business unit or division when we've got 150,000 customers, and we're not leveraging that customer base who are buying, let's say, their insurance, their mortgage, or doing their either personal or commercial banking somewhere else? Like, why don't they even know we sell insurance, or offer mortgages, or have personal bank? So they're getting it somewhere else. So we were trying to understand, as we got more engaged, first of all, what the financial impact of a customer that has one of these categories versus 2 versus 3 with us. Like, what's the financial impact? So we tried to translate that into dollars. And the mistake I made was I tried my best to bring along all these key CX leaders. We had the equivalent of a governance council. And there was one in particular that was kind of nodding his head, and I thought he was on board. But at the end of the day, he felt threatened by this metric, and these are my words, because he was concerned that he couldn't control how many widgets the other division sold. And so he ended up pushing back on that, both to me and both without me there. And the whole thing went sideways for about 3 years. A big miss on my part. I was playing the role of the hero more than I should have been. I really should have been more of a guide. To your point, which is understand what their goals are, as one of the elements of that, and then try to do your best to align with them and their goals. So with that said, um, would you mind sharing some of the secret sauce here on how people could go about building these better relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. And that story is just such a great segue because, you pulled out the word guide from trusted guide. I would also pull out the word trust, right?
Yeah.
If you have trusting relationships with people, you encourage them to be open and honest with you about their concerns and you work through it. And I think a lot of that really starts right back at the beginning when you first meet. And that's really my first tip, right? Build trusting relationships with a real
Mm.
emphasis on the word trust. I think when you're new in a role, whether it's you come from internally or externally, listening tours are something that are fairly common and most people do, right? You go around the executives, you kind of the people you're going to be working with, you do a bit of an intro spiel, you learn what their role is. We all do those, but how do you do those well? And I
Yes.
love the concept of the emotional bank account, which is a Stephen Covey thing from 30, 35 years ago, probably at this point. I think we all know how a regular bank account works. You were in banking, so you definitely know. We make deposits, we save up money, and when we need that money later, you withdraw it. Well, an emotional bank account is an account of trust instead of money. So it's an account on how safe you feel with that person. And I think so much of what you do at the beginning of a role in CX needs to be about putting deposits into that bank account, helping that person, helping them understand how you're going to help them so they don't see you as a threat, so they see you as a partner. And then further down the line, you will have the opportunity to withdraw from that bank account, to call in a favor, to ask for their help or their support or their buy in with a particular initiative that you're trying to get off the ground. Um, so it really is so important to build that level of trust in the beginning. Another way of doing that, I always think, is by exhibiting empathy, not just sympathy, right? It's the
Mm.
old metaphor of don't stand up. If someone's fallen in a hole in the ground, don't stand and say, oh, that must be really tough by looking down on them. Get down in the hole and help them get out. Um, I think in CX, sometimes we're very guilty of that, right? We look at our data and we go, oh, that's broken. Someone should fix it. And actually, it's our job to help them fix it. They've got enough on their plate. And we've really got to get down in that hole, help teams get out of that hole. And the only way you can do that is by learning the business, by knowing the business, by really understanding what the challenges are that they're facing. Because if it was easy, they probably would have fixed it already, right? So if you just come in trying to be the hero again, as you said, oh, I've got all of your answers. That's not going to work. So you've got to lead with that empathy. Help me understand the real challenge here and how I can help you to get out of this challenge, or how I can help make the experience better with your support. That's how you build that trust in that early phase. And you've got to show that you can get your hands dirty, you can get out in the field, whatever that looks like for your business and your company. You can really understand what it is that your customers need, but also what your stakeholders need from you.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about spending time listening, doing the listening tour, capturing their goals, and also being empathetic to what they're going through, owning some of the responsibility to help make it better, but including them. I would also add, in this idea you're sharing also about learning the business, like do your best to learn the business, if you would agree, I'd add on learn a little bit about their business, right? Their
Mm-hmm.
particular area of the organization. But one of the things I wanted to add when it comes to credibility, which is really what you're talking about here, is having knowledge about the business and how it operates and what impacts what, is also be it's paradoxical in the trust world, but be willing to say I don't know when
Mm,
you don't know, right? And
absolutely.
that could be a way to build trust, right?
Yeah, 100%. That was one of the things that, without going too far down memory lane, one of my first ever mentors really told me. Because I think, in my role, I was young, I was fresh out of college, I wanted to prove that I knew my stuff. Um, and the observation was, it's okay not to know. That's an acceptable answer. You shouldn't, because in school, you're never taught that, right? In school, it's like, what's the answer to the test? If you don't
Right.
know, that's a fail. And in the real world, that's not the case. It's okay not to know and say, let's work it out together. Let's go figure it out.
Excellent. Excellent. What other secret sauce do you have for us here?
Yeah, I think once you've built those trusting relationships to get started, it's then about nurturing those win-win relationships. How do you help each other out? Um, Something that a previous leader has really kind of impressed on me is revisit those listening tools that you do every 12 months or so with senior leaders. If you can time it with the budget and goals cycle within your organization, then even better. Like I said, you can't afford to have a static picture in your mind of what people are up against and what their biggest challenges are. And again, you got to go deeper than that, like monthly connect and the very high level. It's again, what's keeping you up at night? What do you care about? What do you wish you knew about the customers that you serve that you don't know today? And how can I help you understand that some more? Another way to nurture those types of win-win relationships is using what I call, and I've borrowed this from another former colleague, the Ebbinghaus nudge, right? So Ebbinghaus is this 19th century German psychologist. That part isn't that important, but he coined the phrase and the theory of the forgetting curve, which is essentially when you receive information, when you hear information, no matter what age and what part of your career you're in, most people forget that information within 1 to 2 days. And really, the way to embed that information is to keep repeating it and keep relearning it until it sticks in your mind, right? You think about languages, and if you hear one vocabulary word once, that's great. But if you hear it over and over again, that's going to stick in your mind. And how I would apply that is when you're thinking about your interactions with some of the stakeholders that you are with, it's good to ask them what they're challenged with and take notes on that. It's great to then follow up a couple of days later and say, hey, I found this article or I found this fantastic podcast on that topic that we were talking about. Maybe this can help. If you want to talk about it more, let's have some dialogue in a future follow up. Because then, otherwise, what happens? We have these conversations, we go on to our next meeting, we go home to our family, and it evaporates. And really, when you've hit on something that's valuable, it's about reinforcing that with a little nudge, with a little follow up to say, "Hey, I'm here to help. Let's talk about this and let's really do something. This wasn't a superficial conversation that we just had." And I think that really helps to nurture those win-win type of relationships with that repetition and reinforcement of those concepts.
I just kudos to you for bringing that up. This is not rocket science, but it's hard to do sometimes and hard to remember. And I love this idea of circling back periodically. I think you're 100% right about the forgetting curve. And I love your idea of sharing an article, sharing a podcast, sharing some information. That what it does is it shows also that you actually listen to them and you care about them. And this isn't all about you and what you're trying to get out of the relationship.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. It is simple stuff. And it's not about the article. It's about how you make that person feel and what that's
Yeah,
going to unlock for you further down the line. Right?
yeah.
That's the key thing that's often missed when you talk about this stuff. It's like, well, I could do that, but I don't have time to go and find these articles or go and, just find a little nugget somewhere or it can be as simple as, I was reflecting on that and I had another thought. How about this? It just shows that you're invested in that person, investing in helping them to be successful. And then again, that deposit in the emotional bank account is something that you can withdraw on. It's something that you can capitalize on further down the line, which is what's going to make you successful in the long term.
Great advice. Great advice. What, if anything, did we miss?
Well, I think the third one, I think with relationships is about activating, right? Once you've got these trusted, nurtured relationships, how do you activate those relationships to make the most of it for you and your program, right? You've already helped out people. How do you get something back? I kind of frame this, and again, another former leader who you've actually had on the podcast, Roxy Stromanger, talks about this a lot. You've got to build an ally network, right? You've got to have a lot of eyes and ears, particularly in a large organization. You can't be in every conversation, in every meeting. And CX gets discussed a lot when CX are not in the room. So
Hmm.
how do you really like tap into that network that you have and be very upfront and direct, particularly if there are people who believe in you, believe in your program, want to see you be successful. And then I think the other thing that I would say on activating your relationships is help people execute the change that you're proposing. I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. It's don't just point at squeaky wheels, help people fix them. Mark, I know you're a huge advocate of change management in CX, and I've learned a ton from you on that, I will say. I think, whatever change model you subscribe to, let's just take ADCAR as one of the more popular ones. Often in CX, we talk about the first few phases, right? Awareness and desire. We want to get people excited about making change that's going to make it better for the customer. And when I started, that was the job. That was kind of what people expected us to do. I think where we struggled as a profession more recently is people are busy. People don't always have time to go and act on our ideas. You've got to help them. So in ADCAR, it's about giving people the knowledge on how to change, sure, but then also the ability to go and change. And you can't just check out once you've got someone excited about an idea. You've got to help them manage the change with their team, manage the change with their customers, and really be an advocate for them and someone who's going to be a catalyst in that process, because it's a lot. Driving change within any organization is a lot.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant, great tips. One in particular I wanted to double tap on, which was this idea of the eyes and ears, and having advocates across the organization. I remember, this is going back decades. I was a new sales manager at a company called Boise Cascade Corporation. And the general manager who came into our city where we were working was talking about going on ride-alongs with the sales reps. This was both to get to know them better, to understand, watch them selling, watch them in action, but also learn from them and perhaps give some guidance. And he said, as a manager, the term is always scheduled, never have to ask. And what he meant by that was that if you're doing that well, then they're reaching out to you saying, can you come along? I know you're in town. Can you come along with me? I'm going to make calls today. And they never have to ask to get on the calendar.
Love that. That's so great. Like always available, but always busy at the same time, right? Like there's always so many things that we can be doing, but when you make the time for people, CX is a real relationship business, as we've been talking about. That I think is what, that pays off in the long term. And it's so, so important to be available for people, to be there to help, and then to help them be successful, because that's ultimately what we're here for. We're very much a support function. Our job is to make other leaders in our organization be successful, to help them take the credit and then trust that that's going to be recognized and appreciated on the other side.
Yeah, well said. Well said. We are better served if we think about if we reframe our roles as the guide, trusted guide, instead of the hero.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So if just so many great gems here, just so packed. If you're listening to this one, you may even want to listen to it back, because Stuart just loaded us up with goodies here. But I'd like to ask you the same question that I ask all my guests at the end of the show, which is, what advice would you give to your 20-year-old self?
Yeah, such a great question, and so many things is the short answer. I think the slightly longer answer is, particularly when getting into a career in CX, success, whatever that means to you, doesn't always happen in a straight line. There's going to be ups and downs and bumps and bruises. And everyone who's listening to this podcast who's in a CX role probably knows that, like through experience, and sometimes through painful experience. But it is just one of those professions that if you have that thick skin and that strong inner self-belief that you're doing good work that really makes a difference in the world, then it just makes every day feel so worthwhile, and you can really just make a meaningful difference in people's lives. It won't always be smooth, it won't always be comfortable, but stick with it, and always remember that there's a community of people out there who are going through the exact same thing that you're going through, even if it doesn't feel like it. That was one of the things as a new CX professional a few years ago that I really learned. And I personally leaned into the CXPA. There's plenty of places out there, but go and find your tribe, because they are not most likely in your organization, because they don't understand how tough it is to be a CX professional. But if there's moments where you feel like you're on an island, there are a lot of other people going through the same things. And there's a lot of people who have solved the problems that you're currently facing. So reach out and interact with that community because it will certainly help you and lift you up. And then you can do the same with others as well.
So thank you so much for being a guest on the show. If somebody wanted to, speaking of making connections, somebody wanted to get a hold of you, what would be the best way?
Yeah, always open to connect. LinkedIn is definitely the fastest and easiest way to do that. Send me a connection request or send me a message, and always happy to chat and connect if there's anything I can do to help.
All right, Stuart, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's been a blast.
Thanks for listening to the Delighted Customers podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode or any of my other ones, hit subscribe or follow. I've got a lot of other great guests that are coming up and a lot of other great content, and I don't want you to miss anything. You can find any links or references on the show in the show notes, and you can find those at my website at empoweredcx.com. That's EMPOWEREDCX.com. Also, make sure to check out the other shows in the Agile Brand Podcast Network by going to www.agilebrandguide.com.
The Agile Brand.